The insanity defense. That's what the Trump legal team seems to be offering this week in the wake of special counsel Jack Smith's stunning and damning 45-page indictment, of the former president, charging him with conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction and conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy to violate rights, all charges fueled by his lies per the indictment. The Trump team say, no, he wasn't lying. He truly believed that he won the election. Which, if he truly believed that, would, of course, be insane. But it's not true. As Smith's indictment notes, Trump was informed repeatedly by members of his own campaign and legal teams that he had indeed lost, that there was no massive fraud involved. And Trump himself is quoted in the indictment telling Mike Pence, after his own vice president told him that he, Mike Pence, had no constitutional authority to reject the votes on January the 6th, quote, "You're too honest." Best of all, one of Trump's own top lawyers, Alina Habba, stood outside the courtroom in D.C. at Trump's arraignment on Thursday and said this in front of cameras, recording her.
I think that everybody was made aware that he lost the election, but that doesn't mean that that was the only advice he was given.
Oh, everybody was made aware that he lost. There goes the insanity defense. But Trump and his supporters in the GOP and on Fox haven't given up with their nonsense defenses. They've spent the past week strawmanning, whatabouting and straight-up lying in response to Jack Smith's latest indictment of the former president. So tonight, let's start by debunking the top 5 desperate defenses of Donald J. Trump. Number 1, and this is the most popular one, this indictment of the former president, they say, is a criminalization of free speech, of political speech. Donald Trump had a First Amendment right to say he didn't lose. How dare the DOJ violate that? Just listen to the folks on Fox.
So they are criminalizing political speech and political interpretation. Those are now felonies punishable by decades in jail.
What this is from Jack Smith is a complete violation of an individual's First Amendment rights.
It's garbage dressed up with a legal thesaurus, and it's criminalizing thoughts, and it's criminalizing speech. You have every right to think an election might be rigged or fixed.
Yes, Greg, you do. You do have a right to think or say that. And you know who agrees with you? Jack Smith. In his indictment, right on the second page, paragraph 3, he says the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome-determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. However, Smith goes on to say, the defendant didn't just speak out about the election or make false claims. He pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. See, you can speak freely as long as you're not engaged in crimes or in criminal conspiracies. We all know this. Conning someone out of their life savings is speech, but it's still a crime. Bribing someone is speech, and it's a crime. Blackmail is speech, and it's a crime. Sharing state secrets with a foreign government is speech. It's also a crime. To quote a headline in the New Republic this week, there is no First Amendment right to organize a coup. Or to quote someone I wouldn't normally quote, Trump's own former Attorney General, Bill Barr.
As the indictment says, they're not attacking his First Amendment right. He can say whatever he wants. He can even lie. He can even tell people that the election was stolen when he knew better. But that does not protect you from entering into a conspiracy.
This isn't that hard to follow. Donald Trump is being put on trial not for what he said, but for what he did. Number 2, they say that Donald Trump is being indicted for defrauding the United States. But what he did doesn't meet the legal definition of fraud. The conservative National Review magazine put out an editorial slamming the indictment and saying, as the Supreme Court reaffirmed just a few weeks ago, fraud in federal criminal law is a scheme to swindle victims out of money or tangible property. Yeah, but they got the wrong statute. Sorry, guys, that was wire fraud. As lawyers like Ken White and Ryan Goodman on Twitter have pointed out, the indictment charges Trump with defrauding the U.S. under 18 U.S.C. Section 371. And here's how the Supreme Court defines defraud under that statute. Quote, to conspire to defraud the United States means primarily to cheat the government out of property or money, but it also means to interfere with or obstruct one of its lawful government functions by deceit, craft, or trickery. That's what Trump did. That's how he allegedly conspired to defraud the US, not in a financial way, but in a very political and anti-democratic way. And it's a felony under Section 371 to do that. Number 3, this is politicized justice, say the Republicans. This is the targeting of a political opponent. Oh, and what about Hunter Biden? Just have a read of what GOP Senator Tim Scott tweeted on Tuesday in response to the indictment. Quote, I remain concerned about the weaponization of Biden's DOJ. What we see today are 2 different tracks of justice, one for political opponents and another for the son of the current president. He continued, we're watching Biden's DOJ continue to hunt Republicans while protecting Democrats. Hunt Republicans. Hunt Republicans. Well, then why haven't all the Republican candidates running for president, including Tim Scott, been indicted, including especially Trump's own Vice President Mike Pence? Why only the candidate who tried to overturn the election? This is desperate stuff from Tim Scott. The truth is that Joe Biden isn't involved in any of the indictments of Donald Trump. He won't even comment on them. His Attorney General Merrick Garland outsourced this latest investigation to Special Counsel Jack Smith to avoid any perception of politicization or weaponization. And as for Hunter Biden, it was a Trump-appointed attorney, David Weiss, again given huge freedom and discretion by Garland, who did that deal with Hunter Biden that so upset congressional Republicans. Again, to quote Bill Barr, of all people, you may not like this case, but it's a legitimate case. It's not weaponization. Number 4, what Trump did in pressuring Mike Pence to throw out votes was not a violation of the law. It was just a technical violation of the Constitution, and those don't count, apparently. This is the newest defense of Trump, rolled out by his newest lawyer, John Larrow, on Meet the Press this morning.
A technical violation of the Constitution is not a violation of criminal law. That's just plain wrong.
What? What? I'll leave the rebuttal of this one to Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin, a constitutional law professor himself, who also appeared on Meet the Press shortly afterwards.
Well, first of all, a technical violation of the Constitution is a violation of the Constitution. The Constitution in 6 different places opposes insurrection and makes that a grievous constitutional offense. So our Constitution is designed to stop people from trying to overthrow elections and trying to overthrow the government. But in any event, there's a whole apparatus of criminal law which is in place to enforce this constitutional principle. That's what Donald Trump is charged with violating. He conspired to defraud the American people out of our right to an honest election by substituting the real legal process we have under federal and state law with counterfeit electors. I mean, there are people who are in jail for several years for counterfeiting 1 vote. If they try to vote illegally once, he tried to steal the entire election. And his lawyer's up there saying, oh, that's just a matter of him expressing his First Amendment rights. That's deranged. That is a deranged argument.
Deranged. Well said, Congressman. And last but not least, number 5, whataboutism. Well, what about the Democrats? Didn't they do the same thing? Didn't they do all of this before? Listen to GOP Speaker Kevin McCarthy speaking this week.
I could say the same thing that Hillary Clinton says about her election that she lost. I can say the same thing about the DNC who said it about the 2016 race. I can say the same thing about those in the Democratic Party from the leadership on down about George Bush not winning, that Al Gore did. But were any of them prosecuted? Were any of them put in jail?
Well, no, they weren't prosecuted and weren't put in jail because they didn't do what Trump did. They didn't try and overturn an election. Al Gore conceded. In fact, Al Gore was the sitting vice president who counted George W. Bush's electoral college votes and who didn't do what Trump falsely says Mike Pence had the power to do. Hillary Clinton conceded too. So sure, some House and Senate Democrats voted to object to some states' vote counts in January 2001 and January 2017. But not as part of a plot to overturn the election, not with the aid of fake electors, and not at Al Gore or Hillary Clinton's direction. Republicans are gaslighting you when they say Democrats did the same. Of course they didn't. What Donald Trump did in terms of trying to overrule the votes in Georgia and trying to get the DOJ to make false claims of voter fraud and trying to get Mike Pence to throw out votes and trying to submit fake electors, no president, no party has ever done before. What Trump did is what he is being prosecuted for, not for what he said. And that they keep coming up with one ludicrous, dishonest, demonstrably false argument after another is evidence that they know, this time, finally, he's in serious legal trouble.